by the time my manager cornered me in the service hallway, my hands smelled like lemon sanitizer and roasted garlic, and my phone was vibrating against my thigh like a constant warning I couldn't ignore. I didn't need to look to know it was the school nurse. I'd seen the first message during a tray run. Mia had a fever. They wanted me to call. Pickup recommended. I'd typed back with one thumb while balancing plates with the other, promising I'd handle it. Apparently, I wasn't allowed to handle anything except blame. The hallway by the back door always felt like winter. Deliveries came through there. So did the quiet humiliations management didn't want customers to witness. He stood too close, blocking the narrow path like my time belonged to him. In his tight, clipped tone, he told me a VIP had complained. Not about the food, not about the wait, about me, about my face, about the fact that I hadn't smiled enough while pouring a glass of red wine I could never afford. He talked about respect like it was something I owed to money, not to myself. My first instinct was to defend myself. I could replay every second of the last hour. I'd been steady, professional, the kind of pleasant that costs you something, but defense was a luxury, and I was already overdrafted on luxuries. All I could see was my fridge at home with the rent notice taped to it, $1,200 due in 5 days. I was short $280 even after my last freelance translation deposit hit. I could almost hear the math clicking in my head. Groceries, daycare, copay, the electric bill, Mia's field trip envelope sitting on the counter like a dare. My phone buzzed again, harder this time, and panic climbed my spine. I pictured Mia at school, cheeks flushed, eyes too bright, trying to be brave because she knew I worked nights. 6 years old and already learning how to swallow discomfort so adults didn't get angry. I wanted to run. I wanted to scoop her up and take her home and make soup and pretend the world didn't charge interest on being tired. Instead, I stood there while my manager stacked consequences. Next week's schedule could shrink. My tables could be reassigned. He didn't even need to say the word tips for me to feel it like a hand around my throat. Tips were groceries. Tips were rent. Tips were the only reason I could keep telling myself we were going to be okay. So I nodded like I accepted the blame. Survival has its own language. I let my face go blank, then softened it into something polite, because that mask paid better than honesty. Inside, something sharp and furious scraped at my ribs. Vespa and Vine looked warm from the dining room, brick walls, candlelight, the perfume of basil and butter, but behind the scenes it was just heat, noise, and people with power taking whatever they wanted. I'd taken this job in River North because the owner said my Italian would be useful. He hadn't mentioned that my dignity would be optional. When my manager finally stepped away, I stole one micro-breath and called the nurse with trembling fingers. The calm voice on the other end confirmed what I already knew. Mia's temperature was climbing, she was miserable, and she needed to go home. They asked how soon I could get there. Soon, I promised, because soon was the word I used to make impossible things sound manageable. I slid my phone back into my apron and walked into the dining room like nothing was wrong, because that's what working-class moms do. That's when the front door opened. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't have to be. The room shifted anyway, like someone had tightened a rope around every conversation. A server near the bar straightened. The hostess's smile turned careful. A man stepped in wearing a suit that looked like it had never met a wrinkle. Dark coat, broad shoulders, calm like he owned the minutes in the room. He moved with the kind of confidence that made people unconsciously step aside. 2 men followed half a step behind him. Not chatting, not hovering, just there in the way a locked gate is there. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know anything except that my stomach dropped with the same instinct I got when a car lingered too long near Mia's school. Trouble, polished and quiet. My manager's eyes snapped toward me, and I felt the unspoken order land like a weight. Corner table, VIP treatment, fix your face. My phone vibrated again, and my feet started moving toward the corner table anyway, even as the air around that man seemed to change the whole restaurant. I forced my feet to keep moving toward the corner table, because if I stopped, I would feel every crack in my body at once. The dining room was warm with garlic and butter and candle wax, but my phone kept vibrating against my thigh like a tiny alarm. Mia had a fever. The school nurse wanted pickup, and my manager had just made it clear that tonight, the VIP mattered more than my kid. The man didn't look like a regular customer. He sat with the calm of someone who never waits for permission. Dark suit tailored close, hair neat, posture relaxed like the chair was built for him. 2 men lingered at a distance near the bar, near the door, empty hands, empty plates, eyes quietly sweeping the room. Even the servers moved differently, shoulders tighter, voices lower, I could feel the whole place making space without being asked. My manager's gaze tracked me across the floor like a leash. I put on my service face anyway, the one that said, "I'm fine. You're important. Nothing is wrong." Inside, I was doing math. Rent was $1,200 in 5 days. I was short $280. Tips tonight would decide whether I begged my landlord for grace or lied to Mia about why we couldn't buy the fruit she liked. The corner table sat half hidden behind framed photos and old Vespa posters, shadowed enough to feel private, close enough to the kitchen that I could hear plates clatter and the espresso machine hiss. I reached it, breathed in, and gave my usual opening like I hadn't been threatened in a cold hallway 10 minutes ago. He looked up, and I felt the air tighten. His attention wasn't flirtation. It wasn't rude. It was sharper than both, like he could read the exhaustion under my makeup and the panic under my posture. I hated that my spine went rigid automatically. He ordered an expensive bottle like it was nothing. I nodded like it was normal. My hands stayed steady because shaky hands meant fewer tips. As I turned to place the order, his phone rang. He answered in Italian, low and fast, and my brain grabbed meaning before I could stop it. A shipment delayed, a schedule slipping, someone pushing a meeting to Thursday. The words were plain, but the tone carried pressure, the kind that makes people comply without raising their voice. A cold thought slid through me. I shouldn't let him know I understood. I came back with the wine and poured. Eyes on the glass. Candlelight caught a heavy watch and ink along his forearm where his sleeve was rolled clean. Deliberate lines that looked chosen, not impulsive. My phone buzzed again and I nearly flinched. I pictured Mia on that vinyl cot in the nurse's office, trying to be brave because she knew I worked nights. The image made my throat burn. He ended the call and studied me like he'd heard the vibration too. Like he'd heard my life pressing in. He asked about my accent, about how I learned Italian, and I felt my mask strain. I gave the safest truth I had. Family roots, translation work on the side. Tonight I was just working. His mouth curved like he found it mildly entertaining that I was trying so hard to stay neutral. Then his gaze dipped to my hands, and the tiny tremor I couldn't fully control. I hated being readable. I hated that some part of me felt relief at being noticed at all. He ordered dinner and ate with quiet focus. Between bites, another call. Italian again. This time I caught a line about someone arriving late and owing an explanation. Nothing I could point to. Just a tone that reminded me of my landlord when he said excuses didn't change what was due. When I returned with bread, he looked up like he'd been waiting for me. He asked why someone who understood language was carrying plates and shoes that pinched. The question landed like a slap dressed up as curiosity, like my manager's scolding, like every person who had ever mistaken my job for my limits. I could have smiled. I could have lied. I could have given him a pretty answer that kept me safe. But my phone buzzed again, and I was too tired to perform. I let the truth slip out in the only way I could blunt, unpolished, honest enough to hurt. Rent, bills, survival. The math that decides whether my daughter eats something warm or whatever is cheapest. The reason I was here instead of home with a sick kid. For a beat, he didn't move. His expression shifted by a fraction, like he'd expected softness and got steel. He didn't apologize or retreat. He just looked at me longer, and the attention felt less like inspection and more like respect. Like he recognized survival as its own kind of strength. That should have soothed me. Instead, it made my cheeks burn. Half anger, half something I refused to name. I stepped away before my voice betrayed me. I walked toward the kitchen on legs that suddenly felt unsteady, listening to plates and espresso and laughter like background noise from another life. Cold air curled under the back door, biting my ankles, reminding me Chicago winter always waited outside no matter how warm a room pretended to be. In the hallway, I finally checked my phone. Another message from the nurse, still firm. Pickup needed. I swallowed hard and sent back a promise I wasn't sure how I'd keep. Then I leaned against the wall for one breath and replayed the corner table. Italian on his tongue. Quiet men watching, the way the room had shifted around him. I still didn't know his name, but I knew the type of gravity he carried. Men like that didn't pass through once and disappear. They returned. And next time I had a feeling he wouldn't just order wine, he'd do something that made the problem impossible to ignore. I told myself I wanted him gone, that I had enough problems. But walking back to the line, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd just collided with someone who never forgets a challenge. And that he'd come back, not angry, but curious, very soon. 3 days after the corner table, my life was still running on alarms. Mia's fever broke, but the school note said she couldn't return for 24 hours, which meant I missed a morning shift at the cafe and lost the tips I'd counted on. My landlord slid a reminder under my door anyway. Polite font, sharp meaning. At 6:15 p.m., I dropped Mia at my neighbor Mrs. Lang's apartment with a bag of crackers and my forced smile, then hurried through River North Wind toward Vespa and Vine, rehearsing apologies I shouldn't have to make to anyone tonight. Inside, the restaurant wrapped me in heat and noise. Garlic, wine, clinking forks, the espresso machine hissing like it was annoyed with all of us. I tied my apron, checked my phone for updates, and saw only one message from Mrs. Lang saying Mia finally fell asleep. Relief lasted one heartbeat. Maria at the host stand waved me over, eyes wide, and I caught my manager watching. The VIP was back, she mouthed. And worse, he had asked for me by name. My stomach tightened. Not flattered, just alert, because men who noticed me usually wanted something I couldn't afford. I crossed the floor with my shoulders squared, pretending my pulse wasn't sprinting. The corner table held him the same way it had before, as if the shadows were loyal. Dom Russo, still nameless to me in that moment, sat in a charcoal suit, sleeves casually rolled, tattoos peeking like private warnings. Two men lingered near the bar again, scanning mirrors and exits with lazy precision. I felt their attention slide over me and past me, assessing distance, angles, risk. I hated how my body recognized the choreography and went careful without being told. Even my smile felt like borrowed property tonight. He waited until I set down water and bread, then angled his gaze up, calm and heavy. Instead of ordering, he asked me to pause, just for a minute, and the request sounded like an expectation wrapped in manners. I told myself I was working, yet I sat because the room was slow and because saying no felt like inviting a fight I couldn't win. Then, with no flourish, he apologized for the way he'd spoken to me last time, calling it unacceptable, full stop. No excuses, no charm, just a man admitting he'd been wrong, letting the air settle. It knocked me off balance more than a threat would have. Men who moved like him usually collected apologies from other people, not offered their own. My first reaction was suspicion. My second was anger that I had to be surprised by basic respect. I let my face stay neutral and thought, tiredly, that I wasn't going to thank him for meeting the minimum standard of decency. I also knew my manager was watching from across the room, measuring my tip potential like a stock price. So I kept my voice steady and my spine mine even while I shook. He told me he needed a translator, not for menus or tourist chatter, but for documents that lived in the gray zone between law and culture. Contracts, grant language, correspondence with Italian institutions, things where a wrong word could become a wrong promise. He said he'd met agencies and heard polished competence, but he wanted someone who carried the language in their bones, someone who could catch subtext the way I'd caught his phone call. My stomach dropped, so he had noticed. My brain screamed to be careful, and my curiosity leaned forward anyway because my daughter needed safety, not pride. Then he named the contract length 6 months, possibly longer, and the monthly pay, $12,000 per month. My breath caught so hard it felt like my ribs locked. I pictured paying rent early, buying me a new winter boots without waiting for a sale, saying yes to a school field trip without checking my bank app first. The dopamine hit was immediate and shameful. I forced myself to look for the hook. A hidden demand, a personal favor, a reason he'd choose a waitress with a translation degree and a worn-out life. Opportunity never arrived without teeth, especially for women like me, ever. I made myself think like a mother, not a desperate person. I told him I would not agree to anything without reading every clause, confirming the scope, and knowing exactly who I'd be working for. Instead of pushing, he slid a business card across the table with heavy stock that caught on my fingertips. Dominic Russo, it read, with a title about cultural development and a foundation name beneath it. The address was in the West Loop, a glass and brick building I'd passed on train. He invited me to stop by, review the documents, and walk away if I wanted. After that, he ordered dinner like nothing had happened, and I served him like nothing had changed. But the floor under me felt tilted. I kept checking my phone between tables, waiting for Mrs. Lang to say Mia woke up, waiting for my landlord to text, waiting for the universe to demand payment for hope. Dom ate, took another Italian call, then paid and left a tip that was generous without being flashy. Fair, like he wasn't trying to buy me, only to be taken seriously. When he left, the room seemed louder, and my cheeks burned with my bluntness. Past midnight, after side work, I rode the bus home with my coat zipped high, and his card in my pocket like a live wire. Mia was asleep on Mrs. Lang's couch when I picked her up, warm and heavy, and I whispered that tomorrow would be better. At home, after I tucked her in, I opened my laptop and searched Dominic Russo. The results were polished. Charity photos, a foundation page, an address, and one gala shot beside an older man with the same eyes. No scandals, no answers, just that vague weight around the Russo name in Chicago. I stared at the screen until my eyes ached, then listened to Mia's breathing through the wall and felt fear clamp down. Safety first. Always. Still, I was tired of surviving. Dom's offer might be a trap, or it might be the first door I'd seen in years, so I chose the risk I could live with. Tomorrow afternoon I would go to his office, on my terms. I'd set childcare, bring a notebook, and read every clause. I'd ask questions until the answers held. If anything felt wrong, I'd walk out. If it felt right, I'd take a step. That morning I packed my tote like it was armor. Notebook, pen, printed questions, Mia's emergency card, and the last granola bar from our pantry. Mrs. Lang agreed to watch Mia after school, but I still left a backup plan on the fridge in case she changed her mind. On the train, I rehearsed what I needed to ask, who the partners were, what the deliverables looked like, how payment worked, what happened if I walked away. I promised myself I would not be dazzled. I would be certain. Mistakes cost pride when a child is waiting at home tonight. His address sat in the West Loop, close enough to the river that the wind tasted metallic. The building looked like reclaimed industry turned into money, brick and glass with a lobby that smelled faintly of cedar. A doorman nodded before I even said my name, and an elevator opened as if it had been waiting. On the ride up, another man in a plain coat stepped in. Not quite a guard, not quite a stranger, eyes quiet and steady. I told myself it was normal for executives. Still, my skin kept noticing him. Doors opened. My heart jumped anyway. Inside, the space wasn't corporate at all. It was a loft that breathed, exposed beams, huge windows pouring daylight across polished concrete, and shelves lined with art books like someone actually read them. A restoration table sat in one corner, scattered with frame fragments and tiny brushes, the kind of patient work that can't be faked. On the walls, contemporary prints mixed with black and white photos of old neighborhoods, heritage without nostalgia. The espresso station could have belonged in a cafe in Naples. Stainless steel, precise, spotless. Expensive, yes, but purposeful, not cold. It made my kitchen feel like a joke. Dom stood from behind a broad wooden table, dressed down in dark slacks and a crisp shirt. Sleeves rolled to his forearms as if work was physical. He looked polished anyway, the kind of man who carried discipline like cologne. A thin chain caught the light at his collarbone. The tattoos were there again, deliberate lines wrapped around muscle. He greeted me with calm that didn't reach for charm, and he offered espresso like it was a peace treaty. As he pulled the shot, he measured time and temperature with quiet certainty. I watched, unwillingly impressed. It steadied me, briefly. He laid out folders, not messy stacks, but labeled packets with tabs: scope, timeline, compensation, confidentiality. I read like my life depended on it, because it did. The role wasn't just translating. It was cultural consultation, tone alignment, and preparing public materials so Italian partners and American donors heard the same promise. 6 months, with an option to extend. Payment clearly stated, $12,000 per month. Deposited on set dates, no tip roulette, no begging managers for hours. There were deliverables, response times, and a workstation listed in the office, plus remote flexibility for pickups. That detail made my throat tighten. I hunted for traps the way I hunt for hidden fees on daycare forms. The confidentiality clause was strict but standard, tied to sensitive planning, not my personal life. Rights and ownership were clear. My translations belonged to the project, but my name could be credited with consent. No creepy non-compete that would lock me out of other work forever. Termination terms went both ways, with notice requirements and payment for completed milestones. There were references to partner institutions in Italy, kept formal and boring, exactly what legitimacy looks like. He suggested an attorney review it. I exhaled for once. While I read, he kept the espresso cups warm, turning one slightly so the handle faced outward, a small courtesy that felt practiced. He didn't hover, but he stayed present, answering questions with patience I didn't expect. The precision of the shot, the clean wipe of the counter, the way he rinsed the portafilter like a ritual, all of it said he believed some things deserved personal attention. I told myself not to romanticize it. Attention to detail could be kindness, or it could be control. With men like him, you had to watch which one it was in practice. By the time I reached the signature page, my suspicion had softened into cautious relief. We discussed logistics, Start date Monday, flexible hours, occasional evening events, and an agreement that I could step out for school calls without being punished. He handed me a key card for the building and a second copy of the contract to take home. I tucked it into my tote like it was glass. In my mind, I saw Mia's face, her fingers around mine, and I imagined telling her we might not have to count pennies for a while. That thought felt dangerous, like tempting fate. I was almost to the door when his voice, calm again, asked me to pause. The room seemed to quiet around that request. He reminded me of the night at Vespa Vine, when I thought my muttered words vanished under the clatter of plates. My stomach dropped, heat rushing to my face. I had called him something my late grandmother used when a man acted superior, an old dialect jab that translated roughly to hard-headed king. I'd been exhausted and petty, and I'd regretted it the second it left me. Hearing it here made me feel exposed and stubborn. He didn't scold me. He didn't threaten consequences. Instead, he challenged me, in that measured way that still felt like pressure, to say it again and look at him while I did. I understood the real question hiding underneath. Would I shrink because he had money, power, a name people deferred to, or would I stay whole? Shame tried to bend my spine. Then I thought of Mia watching me accept disrespect in silence. I lifted my chin, met his eyes, and repeated the phrase clearly, owning every syllable. For a long beat he watched, then smiled with delighted respect. I left with the contract in my tote and my pulse racing. I walked, thinking of Mia and what $12,000 a month could change. In the lobby, the plaincoat man rode down with me, silent, eyes tracking mirrors and exits. It felt like being escorted without being asked. At the ground floor, he waited for me to step out first, a gesture that could have been courtesy or procedure. Either way, it landed in my gut. Legitimate and dangerous can share the same address. I texted Mrs. Lang to check on Mia and decided I'd start Monday with eyes open. Monday felt like stepping into someone else's life. I woke up before my alarm because Mia had climbed into my bed sometime after dawn, warm and heavy, and for once I wasn't racing a double shift. I made real breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, a banana sliced into coins, not the crushed granola bar I used to hand her in the car. At drop-off, I stayed long enough to watch her hang her coat. My body kept waiting for punishment, but the only thing that happened was I breathed. That exhale felt suspicious, like calm never lasts, but I held it. The first paycheck hit my account on Friday, right on schedule, and I stared at the deposit like it might vanish if I blinked. $12,000 per month meant I could pay rent early, buy me a cough syrup without choosing between that and detergent, and still leave something for savings. I went to the grocery store and didn't keep a calculator running in my head the whole time. When the cashier asked if I wanted a bag, I said yes without flinching. Later, I slept through the night. No late-night translations, no siren of debt, just Mia's soft snore, and quiet. Giving notice at Vespa Vine was harder than I expected. Not because I loved it, but because leaving felt like tempting fate. My manager pretended he was doing me a favor by letting me go without drama, and I let him keep his fantasy. At the cafe, I handed back my apron, and the owner barely looked up from his phone. I walked out into the cold with my hands empty and my shoulders oddly light. For years, I'd been a ghost parent, always rushing. Now I could pick Mia up at 3:30 p.m. and actually mean it. At the loft office, Dom had cleared a desk near the windows for me, stocked with reference books and a laptop that didn't wheeze like my old one. I spent my first morning translating a partnership agreement, highlighting phrases that sounded harmless in English but carried pride or insult in Italian. Fixing those sentences felt like solving a puzzle and saving a relationship at the same time. My brain lit up in a way I'd forgotten. Dom read my notes without dismissing them. He asked what I recommended, then adjusted the draft exactly the way I suggested. No ego either. He was demanding, though. If a line was sloppy, he caught it instantly. If a translation was technically correct but emotionally wrong, he wanted it rebuilt. His calm intensity never rose into yelling. It simply filled the room until everyone matched it. He arrived early, left late, and treated details like promises. Sometimes he brought pastries from a little bakery on Taylor Street because I'd mentioned it once. I refused to swoon, but my tired heart noticed. Respect felt strangely intimate when you'd spent years being talked down to by men with smaller power. It made wary of wanting more. The first shadow showed up in the elevator. The doorman didn't ask for Dom's name. He just nodded and unlocked a second panel with a key. On our floor, a keypad guarded a hallway that led to a back conference room I wasn't invited into yet. Men came and went who didn't look like donors or art staff. They wore plain coats and hard shoes, and they never carried laptops. When Dom walked past them, They shifted like they were making room for weather. I told myself it was corporate security, a city that hires protection like it hires cleaners. Dom's phone voice changed when certain calls came in. The warmth drained out, leaving something flatter, older. He'd speak Italian too fast for the office to follow. And once I caught a phrase about settling accounts that did not belong in an arts proposal. Another time I heard him tell someone to keep the streets quiet around an opening date. He said it like instructions, not hope. My stomach tightened. Then I forced it to loosen. I had signed confidentiality. I was here to translate, not to investigate. Still, my instincts kept writing notes. My pen never touched at all. I started bringing Mia to the office once, on a Saturday, just to pick up a forgotten scarf. Dom wasn't there, but one of the plaincoat men greeted her by nickname like he'd seen her picture. Mia waved, fearless, and my blood went cold. How did he know? I smiled anyway, then walked faster to the elevator, fingers tight around her hand. That night I told myself it was normal, that Dom had mentioned my daughter, that people were being friendly. The truth was uglier. Dom's world paid attention, and attention can become protection or pressure depending on the day. Despite the unease, the work kept saving me. I translated grant narratives that turned Dom's vision into something funders could understand, and I watched my edits travel from draft to final with my fingerprints still on them. I started to believe I deserved a seat at this table, not just a tray. Then Dom told me we had our first major donor preview coming up, and he needed me there as interpreter. Pride sparked first, clean and bright. Then I realized what public visibility means. If the room made space for him, it would start watching me too from now. On Friday evening, I left the loft with a folder of polished translations and a calendar invite for the event, scheduled for 7 p.m. at a Russo hotel downtown. The elevator felt longer than usual. The plaincoat man rode down again, silent, and when the doors opened, he scanned the lobby before stepping out. It was a small motion, almost nothing, but it stuck to my nerves. Outside, Chicago air cut my cheeks, clean and sharp. I held my phone and pictured Mia's sleeping face. This job was real, and it was rescuing us. Dom was real too, and shadowed. That morning I packed Mia's lunch the way I always did, like a tiny promise folded into a paper bag. Apple slices, a peanut butter sandwich cut into uneven hearts, and a sticky note that said I loved her. Then I stood in my bathroom staring at myself like I was about to sit for an exam. Hairpinned, concealer over the faint purple under my eyes. A dress I'd bought on sale with my first deposit, simple and dark. The kind that tried to look effortless while making me feel exposed anyway. At drop-off, Mia hugged me hard and asked if I would be there at pickup. I told her yes, because I could finally say yes and mean it. Mrs. Lang handled the after-school handoff, and I spent the rest of the day repeating my mental checklist. Mia safe, contract real, eyes open, don't get dazzled, don't get sloppy. By 7 p.m. I was walking into the Russo Hotel downtown, the kind of place where the lobby smelled like citrus polish and money. The event space sat behind a set of heavy doors, warm light spilling out in a way that made everyone's skin look healthier than it deserved. Glasses chimed. Music stayed low and controlled, more texture than melody. Servers moved like quiet shadows, and security was there in a way arts events never needed men spaced near exits. One with an earpiece that caught the light when he turned his head. Another posted by a corridor like he was guarding something more valuable than a donor list. My heels felt like a mistake by the time I reached the private lounge. I kept my shoulders back anyway. I wasn't here to be pretty. I was here because I understood the difference between literal meaning and cultural meaning, and those differences could make or break a partnership. Dom was already working the room when I arrived. In public, his calm sharpened into something polished and persuasive. He didn't just shake hands, he anchored people. When he spoke about the cultural center and the youth arts program, his conviction didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded personal, like the project was an answer to a question he'd been living with for years. I watched him switch between English and Italian without losing rhythm, catching names, remembering details, making people feel seen, prepared, dangerous in the most socially acceptable way. I translated in a steady stream at his side, smoothing small, awkward phrases, keeping jokes from landing wrong, turning stiff formalities into warmth. Introductions blurred together donors, advisors, a few officials from Italian cultural circles. The room kept treating Dom like gravity. People leaned in. People laughed a second too quickly. People listened. And I kept thinking about Mia's lunch bag and how my whole life could split open if I made the wrong move here. The test came in a corner near a wall of framed photographs. An older Italian guest, important enough that several people subtly formed a half-circle around him, spoke in a dialect-laced rush that sounded polite at first. My ears caught the softness, the compliments, the careful phrasing. Then I caught the blade under it. The fear that this project would turn tradition into branding, that heritage would get watered down for American comfort, that the Russo name would use culture like a marketing prop. The room quieted in that way it does when everyone senses a challenge but pretends they don't. Dom responded in Italian immediately, confident, elegant, smooth. He meant to reassure. I knew he did, but one phrase he used in idiom that in standard Italian could mean something like, "Don't worry. We've got this," carried a different flavor in the guest's region. In that dialect, it could land like a brush-off, almost paternal, the verbal equivalent of patting someone on the head, a tiny insult disguised as calm. I felt it hit my stomach like cold water. There was no time to panic. I had one job in that moment: protect meaning without making anyone lose face. If I corrected Dom directly, I'd embarrass him. If I translated too literally, I'd let the insult stand. If I softened it too much, I'd make Dom sound weak. All of it mattered, so I reframed. I delivered Dom's response in English as a respectful promise instead of a dismissal, shifting the register up, threading in the humility his idiom lacked in that dialect. I added a cultural clarification the way a good interpreter does it, lightly, almost invisible, something like an emphasis on stewardship, on consultation with artisans, on letting Italian partners lead where tradition required it. I gave the guest the dignity of being right to worry, then offered Dom's commitment as an answer, not a dodge. As I spoke, I watched the guest's face for the smallest change. The tension eased by a millimeter, then another. His posture loosened. He nodded, slowly, like he'd decided Dom was serious after all. The half-circle relaxed. Breath returned to the room. Only then did I realize my hands had gone damp around my glass. A rush of pride rose up so fast it scared me. Not because I wanted applause, but because I hadn't felt that kind of usefulness in years. I wasn't carrying plates. I wasn't apologizing for existing. I had just prevented a diplomatic crack from spreading through the foundation of everything we were building. I tried to swallow the pride down, because pride can make you careless. But it sat in my chest anyway, warm and steady. Dom's eyes flicked to me for a brief second. Not a smile, not a thank you, just recognition. He had felt the shift. He had noticed my precision, and that quiet acknowledgement landed heavier than compliments ever did. The evening kept flowing. More translations, more laughter, more polished optimism. And in the background, the shadows kept breathing. A donor greeted Dom with a familiarity that didn't match their supposed distance, touching his shoulder like it was permitted. Dom's expression stayed pleasant, but his eyes cooled for a beat. Later, his phone buzzed and he stepped aside. I caught only fragments of Italian short, clipped phrases about timing and keeping things quiet tonight. Not art talk. Not donor talk. The same tone I'd heard in the loft when the air got colder. My mother brain started running its own checklist. If this world had teeth, could it bite Mia? Could it bite me? Was I standing too close to a man who drew attention like a flare? When the crowd finally thinned, the music softened even more. The room looked slightly tired behind the glamour, like everyone was ready to exhale. Dom drifted toward the hallway that led to a terrace, and his presence created a small pocket of space around him without effort. I found myself walking with him, not because I was ordered to, but because the night had tied us together in a way I couldn't pretend was purely professional anymore. As the doors opened and cooler air brushed my skin, city lights spilling in like scattered coins, I realized the next quiet moment would be the most dangerous part of the evening. Not the donors, not the officials. The honesty that might slip out when it was just us and the skyline. Cold air hit me the second the terrace door closed behind us, like the city had been holding its breath and finally let it out. Inside, the last donors were still laughing somewhere, but up here the noise turned into a soft hum under the skyline. My feet throbbed in my heels, and when I shifted my weight, I felt every hour I'd spent balancing smiles and sentences. I rolled my shoulders, letting the performance slide off for 1 minute, and my phone buzzed with a photo from Mrs. Lang. Mia asleep, cheeks flushed, hair fanned across her pillow. Relief loosened my ribs. I wasn't a guest at this hotel. I was a mom who had packed lunch at dawn and now stood in borrowed light, trying to look like I belonged. Dom was beside me, hands in his pockets, giving me space the way he gave the room space. I leaned on the railing and watched traffic stream along the river like a slow ribbon of white and red. The wind slipped through the gap in my coat, and I welcomed the sting because it reminded me I was real. Down below, the lobby lights made the hotel glow like a jewel. Up here, the city looked honest, imperfect, restless. My mind replayed the moment in Italian, the dialect twist, the idiom that could have cracked everything. I'd defused it without anyone noticing, and that felt almost scarier than applause. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity. A woman who used to count tip bills in a kitchen now protecting a vision in a room full of power. Another part of me waited for someone to tell me I didn't belong. Dom's gaze kept finding me. Not hungry, not pitying, focused, like he was learning my courage. He spoke quietly, and I heard the effort it took for him to keep his voice gentle. He didn't talk about the donors or the press or the hotel. He talked about me, as if my name was a fact he'd been studying. He told me he'd watched me that first night at Vespa and Vine, the way exhaustion sat on my shoulders and I still kept moving. He admitted my blunt truth about rent had stayed with him because it was honest in a world full of rehearsed answers. Tonight, he said, my work had proved something to him. I didn't just translate words. I protected meaning, and I did it under pressure without making anyone smaller. Then he brought up the moment in his office when I repeated insult and held his gaze. He called it a line I refused to cross backward. Hearing it made Pulse stumble. What surprised me wasn't the attraction, it was the care with which he handled the danger of it. He acknowledged the imbalance, that he signed my checks and could make my life easier or harder with one decision, and he made a point of stripping that power out of this moment. In my memory, his hands never touched me while he said it. He stood at a respectful distance, letting the cold space between us prove he wasn't taking anything. He promised in the steady way, he promised things that my contract, my paycheck, and my place in the project were not bargaining chips. If I wanted nothing beyond work, he would still trust my skill and protect my stability. He wanted me to know what he felt, and then he wanted me to choose. That kind of restraint felt intimate. It scared me because it meant he was serious. I stared at the city and did the math I always do, except this time the numbers were emotional. Mia was 6. Her world was small and sacred, built on routines and trust. I couldn't bring chaos into our apartment because a man looked at me like I mattered. I'd made that mistake before, not with him, just with men who confused intensity with commitment and disappeared when life got heavy. I remembered being pregnant and alone, translating at midnight, while Mia kicked inside me, promising myself I would never beg for love again. And yet, standing beside Dom, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not need, but recognition. He saw my competence and my stubborn pride, and he didn't ask me to soften it. That was the temptation. Not romance, relief. The idea that I didn't have to carry everything alone, as long as I chose carefully. I turned toward him before I could talk myself out of it. My heart was loud, but my decision felt quiet. I stepped close enough to feel his warmth cut through the wind, and I let my hand rest on his sleeve as if testing whether the fabric matched the man. His stillness was a question, not a demand. In that pause, I checked myself one last time. Mia safe. My choice. My consequences. Then I lifted my face and closed the distance, giving him a kiss that was brief, deliberate, and entirely mine. The cold made the contact feel sharper, like a spark in dry air. When I pulled back, he didn't chase. He stayed steady, letting me set the pace, as if he understood that my trust was something earned in inches. His restraint loosened something in me. For the first time in years, I chose bravery. This didn't turn into a fairy tale. It turned into a fact. The city blinked around us, and I felt lighter and more responsible, because choosing him meant choosing his gravity. Behind the terrace door, a security man shifted, eyes sliding away like he'd seen nothing. Dom's phone vibrated, and his jaw tightened before he smoothed it out, locking something back inside. I thought of Mia asleep under Mrs. Lang's watch, and my relief turned cautious again. When we went back in, I checked my reflection, fixed my hair, and put my professional face on, but it sat warmer now. I went home, kissed Mia's forehead, and lay awake listening to the radiator hiss, replaying the rooftop in my head. In the morning, I'd walk into the loft office changed, with a pulse under my ribs and fear someone with Russo name would notice and test what I meant to Dom. The night after the terrace, I went back to our apartment like nothing had happened, because that's what single moms do. I warmed leftover pasta, checked Mia's forehead, and listened to her ramble about a class pet, while my mind kept replaying Dom's careful distance and my own reckless choice. When she finally fell asleep, I sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing steadied. The city felt louder through our thin windows. I told myself it was just one moment, contained, private, harmless. Then I checked my calendar and realized how naive that sounded in the morning. By morning, I was back in routine mode, packing lunch, braiding Mia's hair, pretending my heartbeat was normal. At drop-off, I smiled at teachers and promised myself I would not let my personal life touch my work. The loft office smelled like espresso and printer toner, and I tried to lose myself in contracts. Still, every time Dom walked past my desk, I felt the shift, like we now shared a frequency no one else could hear. I kept my eyes on the page, translating calmly, but my body stayed alert, waiting for consequence that I couldn't name or control. Late Saturday afternoon, when the light turned gold on the river, the office changed without warning. The receptionist's voice dropped. Footsteps slowed. Even the espresso machine sounded quieter, like it understood manners. I looked up and saw a man in an immaculate coat entering as if the door were his. Victor Russo carried no briefcase, no hesitation, only certainty. He didn't glance around to orient himself. He expected the room to orient around him. Two men hovered a few steps behind. Not guards exactly, but the kind of silence that follows orders. My skin prickled before my brain caught up. Dom came out of his office fast, jaw tight but posture controlled. Victor didn't bother with warmth. His attention moved like a scanner, pausing on details, deciding value. When his eyes landed on me, they didn't brighten or harden. They measured. I felt like a line item. He acknowledged my presence the way someone acknowledges a weak point on a blueprint, noting where pressure could crack a wall. I kept my face neutral and my hand steady on the folder in front of me. Inside, my pride flared. Then my fear followed, because pride doesn't tuck a kid into bed. Victor and Dom spoke in Italian, low and fast, but the edges were sharp enough to cut through walls. I caught fragments about hotels, supply lines, meetings that couldn't be rescheduled, and a tone that made it clear this wasn't fatherly advice. This was command. Dom pushed back with controlled restraint, explaining the cultural program's milestones and how legitimacy builds a future that can't be taken. Victor answered with contempt disguised as logic, implying that art doesn't protect a family, and power does. Their words circled the same wound. Obedience versus identity, legacy versus choice. I kept translating on my screen. When Victor finally looked at me again, Dom's name sat between us like a wall. Victor asked, through Dom's translation, what I did for the foundation. But his real question was why I was there at all. I gave the version of my life. Translator, cultural nuance, contracts, donor correspondence, the bridge work no one sees until it fails. I mentioned credentials without sounding defensive. I kept Mia out of it, because I refused to hand him my softest part. Victor's gaze didn't soften. He filed me away. Dom's shoulder shifted slightly, the smallest protective angle, and my chest ached. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket, and I felt the familiar jolt of dread that only parenting can teach. I glanced down and saw Ethan's name. My throat tightened before I even opened it. The message wasn't a rant. It was polished, legal-shaped, with a deadline and references to parenting time. He claimed he had counsel now and intended to revise custody arrangements, starting immediately. My hands went cold. I pictured Mia's face at pickup, the way she trusts me to keep her world steady. I locked my screen, forcing calm, but my pulse roared behind my practiced smile. Ethan hadn't paid child support on time in months. He'd never sounded organized about anything except excuses. Now he suddenly had a lawyer, paperwork language, and the confidence of a man who believed he would win. The timing made my stomach twist. Victor Russo had just walked into my workplace like a storm with a suit, and Ethan had just stepped into my life with legal firepower he couldn't afford. I didn't have evidence. I only had pattern recognition and a mother's instincts. Still, the dread felt real in my bones. Someone had noticed Mia, and I could be moved. I kept working because that's what fear makes me do. Perform normal so no one smells blood. But inside, I drew a line as clear as ink. Mia was not a bargaining chip, not a message, not collateral for anyone's power games. Victor might control outcomes, and Ethan might be desperate enough to borrow influence, but I would burn every bridge before I let my daughter become currency. Then I watched Dom absorb his father's pressure. His control stretched thin. He wasn't aiming at me. He was trapped too, and that made my anger sharper, and my empathy unwillingly real. Victor left, but the office stayed tense. The men by the door lingered. The elevator asked for a code on my way down. Dom escorted me to the lobby without touching me, his eyes tracking corners like they mattered. In my car, I reread Ethan's message twice. That night, after Mia slept, I opened my laptop and pulled every custody email and receipt. I wrote questions on a legal pad. Why now? Who funded this? And what did Victor see in me? Before midnight, my decision hardened. I would ask Dom for the truth, and I would not accept silence. At dawn, I made Mia oatmeal and kissed her temple, smiling like the world was simple. Inside, my mind replayed Victor's cold appraisal, Ethan's custody threat, and Dom's tense restraint. I'd stepped into a machine with rules I didn't write, and I could feel it turning. On the train to the loft, I rehearsed what I needed: facts, boundaries, and a plan that kept my daughter untouched. Romance meant nothing if Mia wasn't safe. When I walked into the office, I skipped espresso and went straight to Dom, ready to demand the truth about Victor, Ethan, and the shadows today. I didn't sleep after Victor walked out. I kept hearing the elevator chime, seeing his eyes land on me like a price tag. Ethan's message sat open on my phone, all deadlines and court words, and every time I blinked, I pictured Mia's small hand in mine getting pulled away by paperwork. By 3 a.m, I was doing the same math I used to do with rent. How much fear I could carry before I cracked, and how long before someone noticed. I hated that love and safety felt like competing jobs again. At 6:30, I made oatmeal, packed Mia's backpack, and smiled until my cheeks hurt. I left her with Mrs. Lang, the neighbor who charged less than daycare and asked no questions, and I pretended my voice was steady when I reminded her about the pickup time. On the train, I printed screenshots in my mind. Ethan's legal threat, Victor's cold appraisal, the extra key code on the elevator, the men who watched exits. Comfort was useless now. I needed facts, and I needed Dom to stop protecting me from them because Mia deserved safety, period. I waited until evening, when the loft emptied and the river outside turned black. I finished a grant draft with hands that wanted to shake. Then I cleaned my desk like tidying could control my life. Dom was by the espresso machine, sleeves rolled, face tired in a way he never showed in public. The quiet felt private but not soft. It was the kind of hush you hear before someone tells the truth. I told him, in my own blunt way, that guessing was over. I laid my phone down, screen up, like evidence. His eyes dropped to Ethan's name on the screen, and something in him tightened, not surprise but recognition. He didn't ask me to calm down. He didn't dismiss Victor as just family drama. Instead, he let out a slow breath and gave me the shape of an answer without the messy details. What I heard, beneath the careful phrasing, was that Victor didn't run a normal empire. He ran a web of favors, expectations, and debts that looked respectable until you tried to step away. And Dom had been raised to call that love alone. Then he told me the part that flipped my stomach. The cultural center wasn't only a tribute or a reputation polish. It was architecture, a legal and public structure strong enough to hold him when he pulled away from the old gravity. He needed something legitimate that could outshine the shadows, something partners and officials could point to, something his father couldn't easily poison without exposing himself. He was building a bridge out of the life he inherited, and he was doing it in daylight. My job, I realized, was part of the blueprint too. Relief hit first, sharp and humiliating. The contracts were real, the pay wasn't bait, and I hadn't walked Mia into a scam. Then shock followed, because I'd thought I was saving my own life, not standing inside someone else's escape plan. Anger came last, hot and steady, because an exit still creates debris, and my daughter's name had already been dragged near the edge. I looked at Dom and saw a man trying to unlearn control, trying to build a self without fear. That made me ache for him and want to grab Mia tighter. I told him Ethan had never moved like this, never sounded backed by anyone but his own ego. Dom didn't deny the timing felt wrong. The way he answered, careful and clipped, told me he couldn't promise Ethan was unrelated, only that Victor noticed every weakness and used it. I understood then that my motherhood was visible in their world, the way money is visible in mine. If Victor wanted Dom to obey, he would attack what Dom cared about, and Dom cared about me now, which meant Mia had a target on her back. My voice went steady in that dangerous way it does when I'm done being scared. I told him my daughter was not part of any legacy fight, not a lesson for Victor, not leverage for Ethan. If Dom wanted me in his life, he had to accept that Mia came first, always, even before his pride and even before my feelings. Dom's face changed, not offended, more like he'd been waiting for me to say it. He agreed in a way that felt like a vow, and I believed him. Still, my stomach stayed tight. Only after that did the second realization settle in. My work wasn't neutral anymore. Every clean sentence I polished, every cultural nuance I protected, helped Dom look like a man the public could trust without his father's shadow. I wasn't just translating Italian into English. I was translating Dom into someone who could live outside Victor's orbit. That made me valuable in a way I'd never wanted. It also made me visible. And visibility is expensive. It costs attention. And attention attracts hands that want to shape you. I felt the price starting to rise. We stood in the dim loft as the espresso machine cooled and the city hummed below. For a moment, I thought clarity would feel like safety. Then Dom's phone buzzed. Once, twice, and his eyes went distant in that trained way. He didn't show me the screen, but I saw his hand tighten and his shoulders square, like a lock turning. My own phone lit with another notification from Ethan, sent too fast for a lawyer to polish. I understood the warning without words. The pushback had already begun, and it was coming for us. Truth did not calm me. It sharpened me. After Dom told me the project was also his way out, I woke up in full mother mode, like a switch flipping hard. Mia needed breakfast, hair brushed, sneakers found, and a smile that did not tremble. I walked her to school with my eyes scanning windows and parked cars instead of clouds. Every ordinary sound felt louder, as if the city had leaned closer. I kept thinking, if someone wants leverage, they will start where my heart lives. Trained me. At pickup, the first wrong detail was a gray sedan, idling 1 block off the school lot. Engine running, no hazards, no parent stepping out. I told myself it was rideshare. It was nothing. I was spiraling. Then I saw the same sedan again at the next light, keeping pace when I turned toward our apartment. The driver never looked over, which somehow felt worse. My hand stayed steady on Mia's seatbelt, but my throat tightened like I had swallowed ice. I sang her silly spelling song anyway, counted her breaths like they were mine. 2 days later, it was not just the car. At the corner store, a man in a clean hoodie hovered near the milk case while I compared prices, never putting anything in a basket. He kept his phone angled low, like he was texting, but his attention kept sliding to Mia. When I moved, he moved. When I stopped, he stopped. I felt my skin prickle under my coat. Back outside, the gray sedan rolled past slow, almost casual. That was the moment my doubt snapped into certainty someone was watching us on purpose. Close. In the parking lot outside our building, I kept Mia pressed to my side. My breath came shallow, my ears tuned for footsteps, my mind doing survival math in ugly fast loops. Distance to the door, keys in hand, neighbors in sight. I buckled Mia into her booster with fingers that wanted to shake, then forced them still because she reads my body like a book. I told her we were playing a quiet game, and I smiled like it was fun. Once the apartment door locked, my knees went weak, then I shook. Finally, I called Dom after Mia fell asleep, whispering into the dark so she would not wake. I did not need to explain much. He already sounded like he had been waiting for this call. By morning, my world had new edges. Someone walked me from the train to the office door without making a show of it. The loft elevator required an extra check. Dom insisted on arranged pickups and a different route to school, framed as temporary. It felt like a net tightening, gentle but undeniable, and my scream said cages can look kind. The safer I was, the angrier I became. That surprised me, until I remembered Ethan standing in doorways, blocking exits with apologies, calling it concern. Being managed, even for my good, lit up that same panic in my chest. At the office, I watched men I did not know keep polite distance, and I felt my own choices shrinking. Mia's schedule shifted without my permission. I could feel myself turning into an object, a liability, a weakness. I hated that Dom could do this with one phone call. Yet part of me felt grateful too. That night I made him sit with my anger. Not as punishment, but as truth. I explained, in plain terms, that protection without consent is still control, and control is my deepest trigger. I told him every change involving Mia had to run through me first. I needed to know who was near my child and why. I needed room to breathe, to work, to parent, without feeling like I was living inside someone else's plan. My voice shook, but I did not soften the message. If he wanted me, he had to trust me. Dom did not argue. He did not perform wounded pride. He absorbed it, and then he changed. The next morning, he asked for my preferences before anything moved. He gave me options instead of orders. He made sure I knew the point was safety, not ownership. When a man waited by the office door, it was with my awareness, not my surprise. When Mia's pickup plan shifted, I approved it first. Watching Dom choose restraint felt like watching a strong door close gently instead of slamming, and it made my fear easier to carry today. Even with the new precautions, the pattern stayed in my mind. Victor's stare, Ethan's sudden lawyer language, the sedan that kept finding us. I did not have proof, only alignment, and alignment was enough to make me nauseous. Dom had warned me that families like his do not release people cleanly, And now I understood the cruel logic. If you cannot stop the man, you squeeze what he loves. I hated being that lever. I hated more that Mia was close enough for someone to try. That thought turned every normal errand into a test. By the end of that week, Dom and I had something like a pact, built from my boundaries and his willingness to honor them. Mia came first, always, and there would be no secrets that touched her. We would speak plainly, even when the truth was ugly. I still felt fear, but it no longer lived only inside my ribcage. It had somewhere to go, someone to carry it with me, and that changed everything. It also sharpened our urgency. Legitimacy had to become loud, public, undeniable, before pressure crushed us, so I worked harder. By the time the grant deadline hit, my life had turned into a loop of coffee, calendars, and quiet prayers. Dom called it a milestone, but to me it was a shield. If the board approved our proposal, the center wouldn't just look legitimate on paper. It would become harder for anyone to smear it, stall it, or use me and Mia as a pressure point. I worked with my phone face down beside my laptop because every buzz still made my stomach jump. I kept telling myself, stability equals safety. Then I got back to work. No shortcuts, no drama, just the clean truth. The hardest part wasn't the legal clauses. It was the soul. Our partners overseas wanted reverence, the donors wanted impact, and both sides could smell a lie. I rewrote the mission statement until it sounded like something a kid could understand and a professor could respect. Heritage preservation became living practice. Tradition became a conversation, not a museum label. I cut fuzzy verbs, swapped fancy synonyms for words with weight, and made sure every promise in English matched every promise in Italian. When Dom reviewed my edits, his calm cracked just enough to show he cared. That made me care even harder for Mia, too. The night before the decision, the loft office looked like a storm had passed through, except the chaos was organized. Draft folders stacked by color, notes on the whiteboard, espresso cups lined up like evidence. Dom paced in controlled lines, never crossing into frantic, but I could feel the tension in how he held his shoulders. I refreshed my email so many times my thumb went numb. Between edits, I texted my babysitter to confirm pickup times, and I checked Mia's backpack for tomorrow's spelling test, because motherhood doesn't pause for grant reviews. Around midnight, the city outside went quieter, and our breathing got loud. When the message finally came through, it was almost anticlimactic at first glance. A subject line, a formal greeting, a handful of sentences. Then the meaning hit, like my body understood before my brain finished reading. Approved, funded, greenlit. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, and the tight band around my ribs loosened for the first time in years. I didn't realize how long I'd been holding my breath, living in a permanent brace against bad news. Dom went still, then exhaled a laugh that sounded surprised, like he'd forgotten he was allowed to feel joy out loud. I felt it too. We didn't throw a party. We didn't call photographers. We just stood there in the warm glow of the desk lamp, surrounded by drafts that had nearly broken me, and let the quiet settle. Dom poured something bubbly into two mismatched glasses we'd kept in the cabinet for some day. I took one sip and laughed, partly from relief, and partly because my hands were still shaking. He looked at me with that steady focus that always made me feel both seen and exposed, and I realized this win wasn't just his. My fingerprints were on every page. My voice was in the bones of it. That was when he said it. Not like a speech, more like a truth that slipped past his control. I could tell he hadn't planned it, because his eyes looked almost nervous, and his hands hovered like he didn't want to touch me the wrong way. In my memory, the words landed soft but heavy. Love, mine, us. He made it clear, the same way he always did when it mattered, that my work, my paycheck, my safety, would never be used to buy my feelings. He wasn't asking for obedience. He was offering his heart with both hands open and waiting to see mine. My first instinct was to protect myself with sarcasm, or logistics, or anything that kept me from falling. I thought about Ethan and the way intensity used to masquerade as devotion. I thought about Mia asleep at home, and how my choices ripple into her little world. Then I thought about Dom. The contracts he let me challenge, the boundaries he respected, the way he adjusted when I demanded agency, the way he looked proud when I succeeded. This didn't feel like a storm. It felt like structure. So I admitted, carefully and honestly, that I loved him too. And I meant it right then. Maybe it was the grant, maybe it was the targeting, but the next thing he offered wasn't a ring or a fantasy. It was proximity. In my memory, he asked if we could share a home, partly because he wanted to wake up beside me, but also because he wanted us safer under one roof he could actually secure. The idea hit me with warmth and alarm at the same time. I pictured Mia's toothbrush next to mine, her bedtime stories in a different living room, her questions about why we were moving. I also pictured losing my independence, and I made myself breathe slowly. I said yes, but only with conditions that protected my daughter and my own spine. Mia would get a vote, not just an announcement. Her school routine would stay steady. I would keep my apartment for 6 months, not as a threat, but as a safeguard for my peace of mind. I needed to know I could step back safely if things went wrong. Dom accepted that without a flicker of ego. In my memory, he looked relieved I was thinking clearly. We listed steps, keys, bedtime rules, work hours, and how to explain the change so Mia could trust it. Love sounded like planning. A few days later, when I tucked Mia in, she asked if the new place would have a window enough to watch the river. I promised we'd find her a view, and my chest tightened with hope and fear. The grant approval felt like a lighthouse, but the water around it was dark. Victor hadn't vanished, Ethan hadn't softened, and Dom and I were choosing to stand closer, not farther apart. As I packed Mia's books into a box, I kept picturing opening night. Strangers filling the gallery, Dom's father watching, Mia's hand in mine. Everything we'd built was about to step into the light. Opening night started in my bathroom mirror, with Mia's glittery shoes on the sink and my own hands shaking around a bobby pin. I'd promised her snacks in my purse, a quiet corner if she got overwhelmed, and bedtime only a little later than usual. I'd also promised myself I wouldn't shrink just because cameras and donors would be there. My dress was borrowed, my lipstick was drugstore, and my heart was all nerves. Mia watched me like a tiny referee, reminding me to breathe. In the hallway, I squeezed her hand and felt the past year trailing behind us. The cultural center glowed inside an old brick warehouse near the river, reborn with warm light and fresh paint. People spilled through the doors in winter coats and velvet jackets, laughing into glasses that clinked like tiny bells. I caught the faint smell of sawdust and citrus from the new wood and the catering trays. Security was there, but it hid in plain sight. Men in dark suits posted like shadows, eyes moving without moving heads. This wasn't a typical arts opening, and I knew it, even while I smiled. Tonight, this place was our proof, and I felt it everywhere. I moved through the crowd the way I used to move through a busy shift at Vespa Vine, except now my uniform was confidence. I bridged accents, softened sharp phrasing, and matched people's intentions to the right words before anyone lost face. Dom worked the room with that conviction that made strangers lean closer. He spoke about kids who needed a safe place to make art, about heritage that deserved care, about Chicago not as a market but as a home. Watching him, I could almost see the man he was trying to become, standing in his own name. Near the back wall, one piece stopped me cold. A mosaic of broken ceramic plates, repaired with gold seams, the cracks not hidden but honored. It looked like a storm made beautiful. I stood there longer than I meant to, feeling my throat tighten. I thought about unpaid bills, about carrying Mia through snow to the school nurse, about swallowing pride so often it tasted metallic. None of that vanished just because I wore heels tonight, but those fractures had become structure. Survival, I realized, could be rebuilt into purpose, if someone believed you were worth the work after all. That was where Victor Russo found me, as if he'd been watching the room and choosing his moment. The air around him felt cooler, and my body remembered the old instinct to brace. His gaze moved over me like inventory, then paused, not unkind, just precise. I expected a warning. Instead, what I felt from him was reluctant respect. In his guarded way, he acknowledged the center was real, and Dom was building something that could outlive fear. He mentioned his late wife once, almost like a scar, and I understood why softness scared him. I didn't forgive him, though. After Victor drifted away, the noise came back in waves, but my thoughts stayed pinned to that strange, heavy blessing. I kept translating, kept smiling, yet my palms were damp. Then I sensed Dom before I saw him, the way the crowd subtly opened, the way attention tilted. His focus cut straight to me across the room, and it wasn't the businessman's scan anymore. It was personal, steady, almost fierce. The music felt quieter. Even Mia looked up from her cookie like she knew something big was about to happen, and my heart started sprinting. I tried to act normal. Dom reached me and the world narrowed to his hands and the hush around us. I saw the small box, the way his fingers held it like it mattered. When he went down to one knee, My mind flashed through me. The waitress swallowing tears, the mother doing rent math, the translator catching the right word under pressure. I felt his meaning more than his speech, how my honesty anchored him, how Mia made him careful, how I kept him from becoming only Victor's son. He pulled our symbol into it, that hard-headed king phrase, asking me to keep my voice. I didn't answer like a girl in a movie. I answered like a mother. I looked at Mia first, because she was my truth before anything else, and she stared back with wide eyes and the kind of trust that makes you want to be worthy. Then I looked at Dom and felt fear, desire, caution, all stacked together. I chose love with my eyes open. My hand reached for his, the ring slid on, and the room exhaled. When Dom stood, relief shook through him, and I understood my yes wasn't surrender. It was a decision for us tonight. Later, after the applause faded, I stood by the mosaic again and watched Mia chase a ribbon on the floor, safe and giggling. I thought about how love hadn't arrived as rescue. It arrived as partnership, as accountability, as two stubborn people rebuilding what was broken without hiding the seams. Dom's world still had shadows at the edges, and I wasn't naive about that. But in the center of the light, we made something real. A home, a project, a promise. If this story stayed with you, like, share, and tell me in the comments what courage means to you.